Welcome to John's Tarot. Welcome to you from wherever you may be listening to this podcast. I hope you're all doing well out there today. You know, whenever you tune into John's Tarot, you're going to have an interesting story, an interesting trip. I invite you into my Victorian study, and we have a little trip. We talk about an interesting topic, and that's what I've brought you today. Today, I want to tell you the story of a desk, but this isn't really a story about furniture. It's a story about a ship that disappeared into the Arctic ice, was abandoned, lost, somehow survived, was recovered by strangers, returned home, dismantled, and ultimately transformed into something that has endured for nearly a century and a half. Today we know it as the Resolute Desk, the famous desk associated with the Oval Office of the President of the United States. But its story begins thousands of miles away from Washington, and one of the great mysteries of the 19th century. In 1845, British explorer Sir John Franklin left England with two ships, the HMS Icarus and HMS Terror. Franklin and his crew were attempting to accomplish something explorers had pursued for centuries, finding and navigating the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic. There were 129 men aboard those ships. They sailed into the Arctic, and then they disappeared. For years, nobody really knew what had happened to them. Search expedition after search expedition was sent north looking for Franklin and his men. And this is where our story begins. In 1850, a British ship named HMS Resolute participated in one of those searches. 2 years later, in 1852, Resolute returned to the Arctic as part of another expedition searching for Franklin. But the rescuers themselves soon found themselves in trouble. The Arctic ice closed around Resolute. The ship became trapped, and it remained trapped. Month after month passed. Eventually, in May of 1854, the crew was ordered to abandon the ship. Imagine that moment. A perfectly good ship, frozen solid in the Arctic, left behind because there would seem to be no way to save it. The crew walked away. As far as anyone knew, HMS Resolute was finished. The story was over. Except it wasn't. Something remarkable happened. After the crew abandoned Resolute, the Arctic ice eventually released the ship. With nobody aboard, it began drifting. The abandoned vessel traveled hundreds of miles through the Arctic. More than a year later, in September of 1855, an American whaling ship called the George Henry discovered the Resolute drifting near Baffin Island. Captain James Buddington and his crew boarded the abandoned British ship and eventually brought her back to New London, Connecticut. Now, this occurred during a period when relations between Britain and the United States were not particularly warm, but the United States government saw an opportunity. Congress appropriated money to purchase Resolute from the salvagers and restore the vessel. The ship was repaired at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and then the United States sailed HMS Resolute back across the Atlantic and returned her to Queen Victoria. It was a gesture of friendship between two nations that had once been enemies. A ship that Britain had abandoned was restored by Americans and returned home. Queen Victoria personally received the vessel in December of 1856, and Resolute returned to service in the Royal Navy. But our story still isn't finished. Eventually, HMS Resolute grew old. In 1879, after decades of service, the ship was finally decommissioned and broken apart. But Queen Victoria remembered what the Americans had done, so some of the timbers from the HMS Resolute were saved. From those timbers, craftsmen at the Royal Navy dockyard at Chatham constructed an extraordinary desk. It was made primarily from the wood of the old ship. In 1880, Queen Victoria presented that desk to the President of the United States, Rutherford B. It was a reciprocal gesture of friendship. America had returned Britain's ship, and Britain returned part of that ship to America. and that piece of wood has remained in the White House ever since. Here's something I didn't realize until I began looking into the story. The Resolute desk wasn't originally an Oval Office desk. There wasn't even an Oval Office when Queen Victoria presented it to President Hayes. From 1880 until 1902, the President's working office was on the second floor of the White House, and that's where the desk was used. Think about the history beginning to unfold around this object. Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield assassinated only months after taking office. Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, assassinated in 1901. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson and the First World War, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover and the beginning of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt and the Second World War, Harry Truman and the beginning of the nuclear age. The desk moved around the White House during those decades, and different presidents used it in different places. So we shouldn't imagine every one of those historic decisions being made while a president sat behind his particular desk. But the desk was there. The presidents changed. Political parties changed. Wars came and went. The country went through prosperity, depression, assassination, and social upheaval, and the desk remained. There's another interesting part of the story. Today, when we picture the Resolute desk, we often picture the large wooden panel across the front bearing the presidential coat of arms. That wasn't part of Queen Victoria's original desk. The panel was added in 1945. There's a popular story that Franklin Roosevelt ordered it installed to conceal his leg braces. But historians have investigated that story, and the evidence doesn't really support it. The surviving designs for the panel actually date from June 1945, 2 months after Roosevelt died. The panel was completed that August. So Harry Truman became the first president to use a Resolute desk with the famous presidential panel that we recognize today. After the enormous Truman renovation of the White House between 1948 and 1952, the Resolute desk ended up downstairs in the broadcast room. President Dwight Eisenhower occasionally used it for radio and television broadcasts, and then Jacqueline Kennedy found it. When the Kennedys entered the White House in 1961, Jackie Kennedy became deeply interested in restoring the historical character of the building. He recognized the significance of this old desk. President John F. Kennedy also had a deep connection with the sea, and the Resolute desk was moved into the Oval Office. For the first time in its history, in 1961, Queen Victoria's desk became the desk we now associate with the presidency. And that's when one of the most famous photographs in presidential history was created. John F. Kennedy Jr., the president's young son, was photographed playing beneath his father's desk and peeking through the little door in the front. Above him sat the President of the United States. Outside that room, the Cold War was raging. Kennedy's presidency would confront the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin crisis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when for several terrifying days the United States and Soviet Union came extraordinarily close to nuclear war. And then, in November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Once again, history changed. The desk remained. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, preferred another desk. So the Resolute desk left the Oval Office. It became part of a traveling Kennedy exhibition and eventually went on to be displayed at the Smithsonian Institute. That means something important when we talk about what the Resolute desk has witnessed. It was not sitting in the Oval Office during the Johnson, Nixon, or Ford administrations, so it did not sit behind Lyndon Johnson as Vietnam escalated. It was not Richard Nixon's desk during Watergate. It wasn't Gerald Ford's desk as the country tried to recover from that period. For roughly 13 years, the desk was away from the White House, and then another president remembered it. In January 1977, President Jimmy Carter requested that the Resolute desk be returned to the White House. and went back into the Oval Office. Ronald Reagan kept it there, so the desk was present during another extraordinary period of American history, in the final years of the Cold War. It sat in the Oval Office during the Reagan presidency as America experienced the assassination attempt against Reagan, the Challenger disaster, confrontation and negotiation with the Soviet Union, and eventually Reagan's famous challenge at the Berlin Wall. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. George W. Bush initially used the Resolute Desk after becoming president in 1989, but after about 5 months he switched to another desk he preferred. During his presidency, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Gulf War was fought. Then Bill Clinton entered the White House in 1993 and returned the Resolute Desk to the Oval Office. And from that point forward, it became essentially a fixture of the modern presidency. Bill Clinton used it through the economic expansion of the 1990s, the conflicts in the Balkans, and his own impeachment. George W. Bush used it during one of the defining moments in modern American history, September 11th, 2001. The attacks on New York and Washington transformed the country, and wars followed in Afghanistan and Iraq. Barack Obama sat behind the Resolute Desk through the aftermath of the Great Recession, the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the operation that killed Osama bin Laden, and years of political and social change. Donald Trump used the Resolute Desk during his first administration through 2 impeachments and the extraordinary disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic. Joe Biden used it during another period of enormous challenge, the continuing pandemic, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, inflation, and the intense domestic political division. And Donald Trump returned to the Oval Office and the Resolute Desk, the beginning of his second administration in 2025. Different presidents, different philosophies, different political parties, different crises, but the same desk. Think about the span of history represented by this object. When Queen Victoria presented the desk to Rutherford Hayes in 1880, the American Civil War had ended only 15 years earlier. There were Americans alive who remembered George Washington. The electric lighting had not yet been installed in the White House. There were no automobiles, no airplanes, no radio, no television, no nuclear weapons, no internet. Since then, America has experienced presidential assassinations, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the nuclear age, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, Watergate, the fall of the Soviet Union, September 11th, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Great Recession, a global pandemic, and profound periods of political division. 27 presidents have served since Rutherford Hayes received Queen Victoria's gift, counting Grover Cleveland's non-consecutive terms as one individual president and Donald Trump's 2 terms as one individual president. Not every one of them used the Resolute Desk. Not every one of those events occurred in its presence. But this piece of timber has existed within the institution of the American presidency throughout that enormous arc of history. And though that brings me back to the name, Resolute, it originally meant nothing more mysterious than the name of a ship. But consider what happened to that ship. It went searching for people who were lost. Then it became lost itself. It became trapped. It was abandoned. Everyone walked away from it. And still its story wasn't finished. The ice released it. It drifted. Someone found it. It was recovered. It was restored. It returned home. Eventually, the ship reached the end of its useful life. And even then, its story wasn't finished. It was dismantled. Its wood was transformed. And part of it became something entirely different. Something that has now survived generations. There is something about that story that speaks to me. Because when we are experiencing difficult times, personally or collectively, we tend to experience the present moment as though it were the entire story. It isn't. There were moments when the HMS Resolute appeared finished. There have been moments when the United States appeared hopelessly divided. There are moments in our individual lives when we can see absolutely no path from when we are able to somewhere do better. Sometimes there isn't a visible path. There certainly wasn't one for the abandoned wooden ship frozen in the Arctic in 1854. But the absence of the visible path does not necessarily mean that the story has reached its conclusion. And perhaps that is the lesson contained in this old desk. Resilience doesn't require knowing how the story ends. Sometimes resilience simply means enduring the chapter you're in long enough for the next chapter to become visible. And perhaps that is what it means to be resolute. I hope you enjoyed the little story. Let's move over to tarot, the tarot screen. What the story exemplifies is that history passes. We are certainly going through a period of extreme political division right now. And I'm not going to go into the details of that. But the Resolute Desk will survive. It is resilient. It will survive this presidency. It will just survive this period of political division. What's important for us is that we survive this period, knowing that as uncomfortable as some of us may be during this period, it will change. That is one thing the Resolute Desk has to teach us. It has survived through history. The presidency will survive through history. The Resolute Desk will survive through history. We need to be resilient. That's what the desk has to teach us, is resiliency, that ability to continue to go forward. So, my ability to read tarot is a gift, an expression of divine love, and I'm here to share it with you in that same spirit. I mean, to contact my little guide. Thank you. And we'll do a little reading, a little 3-card reading. What does the Resolute Desk, what would the tarot like to tell us about the Resolute Desk and resiliency? What would the tarot like to tell us about the Resolute Desk and resilience? Because we need to be resilient. You know, things are bumpy, but we're going to get through it. We have a president in here now. In a couple more years, we'll have a different president. You know, the United States will survive. What would a tarot like to tell us about being resilient and the lesson of the Resolute Desk? No matter what the current occupant of the Oval Office says, nobody's there forever. He would like to be, but nobody is there forever. So, what would the tarot like to tell us about being resilient in the face of obstacles and the lesson of the Resolute Desk? Okay, cut the deck and just do 3 cards, and I guess I could do 3 cards. It was a long story today. First card is Hangman. I just do 3 cards because the tarot, as a pictorial medium of discussion, is a pictorial language, and it gives us a lot of information. So the Hangman. And that's kind of where we're at right now. We're hanging from the tree, from a higher to a lower, and between worlds. The Hangman is a representation of somebody who's between worlds, a higher world and a lower world. It's also the card of Odin. When I do the runes, so Odin hung from a tree and sacrificed one eye in order to gain enlightenment. And that is kind of where we're at. We're in between ideas, we're in between thoughts, we're in between political concepts, and we are in that period of the Hangman. Or one leg is connected to the past, and the future is below us. And we need to have the resilience in order to get through this period and gain the wisdom of what this period is trying to teach us. The 9 of Cups kind of represents where we're at right now, the wish-granting jewel. I know that we're heading into the midterms. Not everybody has wishes about the midterms. And this is going to be close to a political program that I'm going to do. It's promising a better time. No matter what happens, it's promising a better time. That better time is not here yet. because this is a 9. And the 9 is before the 10, but it's promising better times. If things have been difficult, and they have been difficult, things are going to start to improve. Better times will be ahead after the midterms, and I hope so. And then the third card is the 4 of Swords. The 4 of Swords is somebody who's laying on taking a rest. He's laying on the coffin of his ancestors, swords hanging above him, and he's thinking, what does history have to teach us about this period? And this period of change that we've been currently going through. So I think, in terms of resilience, it has a lot to do with reflection. That the first card is the Hangman. We're between 2 periods right now. Things are going to change, but is asking for reflection, reflecting on the past, reflecting on where we would like to go in the future. The 9 of Cups has to do with things are changing. We're heading into the midterms, and even if it's nothing major happens in the midterms, there's going to be another election in 2028, and things are going to change. Hopefully, we've learned from the mistakes and we all make mistakes. I mean, good Lord, I've made my share. We all make mistakes. We've learned from our mistakes in the past, and we're going to do better in the future. And I think that's what the 9 of Cups is representing. And again, in the future, so we're looking at the 4 of Swords, learning from history, learning from our mistakes of the past. What were the mistakes of the past presidencies, so we don't carry them forward? And then in the corner up here, you see a light. You see a church window. The light of wisdom is going to shine through and guide us forward into the next era that we'll be heading into. And we'll see whatever that era is. I'm not predicting that. So for today,
goodbye, Professor Marvel, and thanks a lot.
Well, it was my pleasure. I hope you enjoyed the little story about the Resolute and what it had to teach us about being resilient. Time marches on. The Resolute Desk has stayed a permanent part while time has moved on behind it. Let us do the same. So, until next week, be careful, be cool, be kind, and remember, have courage, find faith, and I'll see you again at the next podcast. Okay, bye-bye.